Hello, everyone, and welcome to our training, How Zero Trust is Transforming the Way You Work. I'm Candace Thorson, Managing Editor at GovLoop, and today I have the extra pleasure of being your moderator. So thanks so much for joining me. And I want to give a special thank you to Amazon Web Services and Veritas for sponsoring this session. So let's get started. A recent report found that every 14 seconds, and this is a sort of scary statistic, a government agency is hit with a ransomware attack. So the question is, how do you make sure that you are not the person who's the weak link in your organization? In other words, how do you make sure that it's not your fault? We have three experts with us today who are going to offer best practices for zero trust cybersecurity to help make sure you and your agency are safe. I do have housekeeping items to get through before we jump through all the good content. So if you're on Twitter, please share what you learned using the hashtag GLTrain. We have great resources available for you to download, so check them out. If you want to access our closed captioning feature, just look for the icon at the bottom right-hand side of your media player. We don't want you to have technical problems, but life happens. So if you do, just ask my colleague Maddie for help, and you can do that by putting a message in the Ask a Question tab. And you can also ask questions of our speakers by using that same tab. And lastly, we are recording this training, so check your inbox tomorrow because we're going to send you a link to the entire session on demand. So I have all that housekeeping stuff out of the way. I want to introduce you to our speakers. We have Jennifer Franks, who is Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at the Government Accountability Office. Timothy Pedro, who is Field Chief Technology Officer for Cloud Architecture at Veritas. And we have David Rubel, who is Head of U.S. Federal Business Development at AWS Storage Services, AWS Worldwide Public Sector. So to just get started on our content today, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is the one that came up with the every 14 seconds there's a ransomware attack statistics. So just to lay the groundwork, and I'll start with you, Jennifer, if that's okay. What does the current cyber landscape look like for government agencies? You're in government, so what does it look like in your experience?
That's a good question, and it's a fast-moving target for us. IT systems supporting the federal agencies are inherently at risk, and working at GAO, we've highlighted this in several of our ongoing reports that highlight the critical issues with how we are facing in protecting our various environments, because our systems are complex, they're dynamic, they're geographically dispersed. Many of us are still supporting a maximized remote work posture, and it's really becoming more increasingly difficult to protect agencies' networks and resources using that old traditional perimeter style strategy. And then, as you know, in the media right now, a lot of the focus is on the increase of emerging technologies like AI. So with those increasing technologies kind of impacting our forecasting and how we are moving across implementing new things within the federal government, they are expanding our cyber attack surfaces, and we are now introducing new vulnerabilities into our various environments. And as this is one of the challenges that we are having and that we are facing as we consider how do we protect that landscape, the goal of the American people, for us working for the federal government, is to really protect the American people, that is. But we don't want to stifle industry innovation or technology or even hurt the economy by really imposing unfair legislation and rules. But we're going to have to do something, because addressing emerging technology specifically is kind of impossible because it is a moving target. And you're looking at some of the unknown vulnerabilities which do impact our landscape environment. So we're going to have to really look at what types of rules and procedures and guidance we can establish at more of that technology agnostic level, and then look at the rules that affect what the technology can do, because necessarily when we do establish new guidances and procedures, the guidance is not going to tell us how to drive what the technology can do.
Very good point. And you're right about AI. I mean, every single day there's another article about AI, so it's constantly it is definitely a changing landscape in that regard. David, I wonder, do you have any kind of thoughts in your experience about government agencies? What's the landscape look like in your view?
Yeah, thank you. And really to the several of the points that Jennifer made, the data security and data protection environment of today is different than it was 2 years ago, even a year ago, 6 months ago. It's a rapidly changing landscape and a continuum where it started with protecting the physical assets, protecting the networks, protecting the physical areas where either data and applications were housed, things like data centers and so on. But now it's kind of gone through that entire perspective to say that we need to protect the data wherever it is, whether it's residing within a storage environment, whether it's residing in the cloud, whether it's residing in both. Wherever that data is, it has to be protected, and not only the data, but really walking up the stack, the network itself, network security. Some of the vulnerabilities that we see out there that are kind of rapidly evolving in the federal government space are attacks that are coming in from the outside. And so that whole notion of that, again, to Jennifer's point, that singular notion of perimeter control is now giving way to a more holistic level of protection that's needed. So it's more of a inside outside protection. That whole zero trust environment is really I think a vision and a direction. And now it's the why and the what, the how part of it. We're working closely, kind of collaboratively, industry and government, trying to actually figure out how best to implement that. The last comment that I'll make is that while we're looking at all of this access control and access security, data protection itself is a very important topic. We see it every day when there's a ransomware attack. So that, how then does an agency operate when its data, its core mission data, isn't accessible? So how is it being protected? Now the backup plan, the COOP plan, the holistic data protection plan, that strategy has to be meaningful, and it has to be exercised and accountable. I think my mind always goes to the NIST cybersecurity framework, where we walk that framework with purpose so that we can effectively, proactively identify risks, take the necessary steps to analyze, and then get to the point of recovery, mitigation, and reinforcing our data protection strategies.
That's great. And talking about zero trust, that's a great segue. I wondered, Timothy, if you could sort of explain the role that zero trust plays in securing government agencies. And I guess when you start, if you could just sort of say basically, like, what is zero trust in general for the layperson, I guess, what are we talking about when we're talking about zero trust?
Absolutely. So zero trust is really a framework and a concept that has been developed over the last few years when it comes to how to build out an IT infrastructure and how to build out IT practices as a whole. And it has kind of blossomed into this whole organization-wide mentality, because it really does affect everybody from the ground up, from the individual users all the way up through systems and data, in order to enforce or minimize the risk. And that's very important here. All it is doing is minimizing the risk to the agency. You can't eliminate the risks just by nature of having machines online. There is going to be a risk associated with that. So you kind of have to accept the fact that, hey, we have this risk. Let's do everything we possibly can to mitigate it, to make it as difficult as possible for one of those, ransomware attacks every 14 seconds to actually be able to get through and impact the agency. But it also goes beyond that. And, you can't just try to prevent these attacks from succeeding. You also have to build entire systems within the organization in order to be able to recover from those, because if with that many attacks occurring, something is most likely going to get through, whether it's a big attack or whether it's a small attack. And you have to have the proper systems in place in order to be able to recover from that attack. And you have to do it in a timely manner. You don't want to be on the news saying we had to pay out a ransom because we had no way to recover from this, right?
That's a bad look.
Yes, it's much better to be, okay, we were hit by a ransomware attack and we recovered all of the data within 2 days, and there was no exposure to it, right? That really shows that your team is on top of things, right? So that is more kind of what you want to strive to. And I know historically that it's been somewhat challenging when it comes to IT budgeting to budget for hypothetical situations that may happen, right? There are so many projects vying for IT dollars that sometimes it can be very difficult to get that budget for the potential disaster that may be coming down the pipe, or the the potential attack that could happen tomorrow. I think with the pandemic, it changed some of that, because, oh, hey, here is an actual disaster. It can happen. But with numbers like an attack every 14 seconds, it's no longer a hypothetical. It's an inevitability, and we all have to prepare for that inevitability.
You would think too that some of the ransomware and the other attacks are big enough that people would pay attention. I mean, I think SolarWinds, like a while ago, I mean, that should be a sign, that you need to pay attention. So budgeting is always a challenge, but it's a little mind-boggling that isn't just automatically understood, that that's a big problem. Jennifer, like lots of times we talk about like the general system, like zero trust or any kind of IT modernization and stuff, but for individual employees, like who are the ones who have to live with it day to day. When you talk about zero trust, how does that actually impact the average employee who goes to their desk, wherever it's located, and has to work and access information and such?
That's a good question. And Tim actually pointed out a lot of how that's going to impact us. So ZTA, Zero Trust Architecture, is no longer going to be something that those of us that know IT, know cybersecurity, and perform those roles and responsibilities for our various organizations just do. It is going to have to be a holistic approach with how we transition our culture to help us to conduct more effective business every single day to support our critical business needs. And the technology is evolving, the vulnerabilities are evolving, the threats are increasing. But we're going to have to increase the educational awareness around what this means. So we all take annual security refresher training. I know at GAO, I'm due to take mine sometime in the next month or so.
Mine is in October, by the way.
Okay, yours is, Cybersecurity Awareness Month. That's timely. So with everyone taking that refresher training, we're always trying to put at the forefront of mind, for those of us that don't dwell in the world, what is cyber, how to be more cyber aware, what should I be considerate of, things that I should and shouldn't click on, how to report, yes, no, and et cetera. However, we're going to have to enhance everyone's situational awareness around how all of the users, whether you are a contractor or a federal employee, to really understand our role and our real active responsibility into really protecting our organization's network, really understanding what good cyber hygiene is. I think people think it's a buzzword, but it's a practice, and we have to implement that practice and assist us with really being more cyber smart and aware to really enhance some of those organizational protections that we're going to need across our various enterprises. One of the trainings we're going to have to really focus on is deepening one's understanding for network authentication. It's a buzzword that we use in our world of IT and cyber, but a general user who doesn't dwell in our world is going to have to really understand the power that we all have as users of an organization's enterprise when we are permitted to access into their systems and use their services. So it's going to take an educational shift for all of our employees.
Yeah. And, bouncing off of that, David, I wonder, one of the problems is passwords, just sort of, bouncing off what Jennifer said. And I admit, I reuse what I consider variations of my passwords. Nobody in the world would. I mean, changing up a couple of numbers is not the same thing. I do get that. But people come up with workarounds. So when you're talking about like zero trust, I mean, people may know intellectually, all right, I'm not supposed to be using the same passwords. I'm supposed to be mixing things up. But do you have any thoughts on how zero trust basically impacts for employees, how they can, I guess, to do better than I do?
Yeah, we're all in this space these days of managing our data. whether it's managing content, whether it's managing access, or even something like passwords and system access. A popular approach today that seems to be gaining traction, at least from the secure access perspective, is two-factor authentication. So at least there's more than that password and common password access that's required sometimes. And you probably already use this in your commercial applications, things like banking and so on, where you get that second and even third. There are some that require third. So yeah, I think that particular aspect, the access aspect, there are some capabilities there that can scale. In hearing the earlier comments, I want to add one additional lens, and it's really from the data management lens. Your original question was, what's the impact to users and potentially to the agency as we look at this zero trust model? I'd like to add the data management lens. So with this approach, what is effectively zero trust started as insider threat a few years ago, because agencies started to realize that the threats weren't coming just from the outside in, that they're originating inside of the agency in some situations. So it is that holistic approach. But from a data management perspective, in order to provide the right proper and comprehensive level of analytics to determine the risk at any point, or the past risk, and create these patterns so that we can identify where there is a potential for a future risk, the probability of the future risk, all user traffic would have to be captured. So that's full packet capture of every user that's on the system all the time. So that creates a data problem, it creates a data management problem. Managing that data in the infrastructure in the primary environment, and then backing up that data in at least 3 other locations. Many times it's offsite to physical locations, and now bring the cloud in as another option to have that third copy available offsite in a backup and incremental backup. So there's data management aspects of this to consider as well. And those are the things that I see sometimes get overlooked, because we tend to focus on that piece of inside and outside security and access control, but we turn around and we have to make sure that we understand the impact to the data infrastructure. Usually it means more storage. Sometimes it means more compute. The value of this data is incredibly important to the agency, where maybe their data science and analytics teams are building machine learning models that would be able to leverage that data for patterns and create some probability and models to determine the risk in an agency, and really kind of get to that risk awareness. The comment was made earlier around situational awareness and risk awareness. We're at an interesting time right now where data is the driver. And now for the agencies, how do agencies effectively leverage that data so they can get to things like risk assessment, risk management, and so on?
That's a good point about data, because it is just, when you think of zero trust, it is just, being able to access the network and stuff. But you're right, data management is a key part of it.
Yeah.
And then Timothy, I'll start with you, but then David and Jennifer definitely jump in. Like the recent Move It attacks, it hit the Department of Energy, it hit a bunch of state agencies, it hit Johns Hopkins and a bunch of other places. That's been in the news, and that's another example of, that should be scaring agencies. But what are some of the biggest challenges that are preventing agencies from being able to avoid attacks like this? Understanding that you're not going to avoid everything. I mean, things will slip by, but what's holding people back?
Well, I think, when you're talking about like the Move It attack and the SolarWinds attack a few years ago, they're all very similar, right? These are 0-day events that occur, and it's in vendor software. So there is very, very little that an organization or an agency can do to truly mitigate that, because it is outside of their sphere of control. That said, there have to be processes in place to deal with the 0-day once one becomes known, right? You can't just wait for, oh, you know what, Move It just announced a 0-day and we use Move It, what are we going to do? There has to be a defined process to go through in order to be able to mitigate that in, as quickly as possible. Whether it is, in the case of Move It, which is a file transfer software, hey, maybe mitigating it is I'm taking that software offline until there is a patch available for it. right? Or maybe, by the time the 0-day hits the news, there actually already is a patch, and a very efficient way of getting that type of patch installed within the organization. But again, there is also the impacts to users, right? Like if I say I'm going to move it offline, what about all those other systems that then impacts? And what about all the users, both internally and externally, that will impact? You could bring down entire engagement models with government agencies, which is not something any government agency wants to do, but it may be required in order to help remediate these attacks, right? Because to David's point earlier, we talk about zero trust in the idea of well, we've got to protect identities, we've got to protect devices, we've got to protect networks and applications and workloads and all that goodness, but ultimately we have to protect the data. Those things are secondary, right? We protect those in order to protect the data, because that is what causes all the problems and solves all the solutions, right? We need to make sure that is secure. And the best way to do things, to David's point, is redundancy across. So if you are impacted, you can't lose data because that data exists in 3 other places. And hopefully you're leveraging things like immutability and indelibility, or what used to be called worm in the industry, write once, read many. That type of technology is a requirement now. In the old days, 10 years ago, we have an archive over
that is old by cyber standards.
Yes, it is. It really is. But we have like an archive off in the corner, and that's the extent of our worm environment. Now it should be just about everything. Any copy of any data should be residing on immutable, indelible storage to make sure that you do always have a copy of that data should something happen to that primary source.
I'm just going to back up a little bit. Could you explain what Move It is and what you mean by 0-day for our audience, what 0-day
sure.
is?
So Move It is basically a file transfer software. It's a way of getting files from kind of one location to another, right? In the industry, stuff like FTP and stuff like that are kind of what the technology is built up off of. But whenever you have anything, I'll say public facing like that, you now have applications that bridge the firewall level of an organization. That is an inherent risk to the organization. And that's really where zero trust comes into effect. As far as 0-day, the term 0-day means typically a vulnerability is found with software. And the way that kind of the industry works is whoever discovers the vulnerability, if they're a good guy, right, then they will notify the organization, hey, Move It, you have a vulnerability here. But they do have a responsibility to let the public know, because the public is using the software, right? And they need to know if they are vulnerable. So typically there's a period of a week, 2 weeks, where they will notify the manufacturer or the vendor, and then they will notify the public, right? 0-day is really, hey, this was just released to the public, or maybe hasn't even been released to the public yet. So people are scrambling to try to find a way to resolve this as quickly as possible before the bad actors and before ransomware starts to leverage this as an exploit that can get them inside of a secure environment.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I wonder, David, could you explain like a little bit about why agency challenges exist, like why they continue to struggle? Just sort of, you don't wind up bouncing off what Timothy and Jennifer have said at different times, but why?
Yeah. I think the heavy thread that we're all talking about here is awareness. First, realizing that cybersecurity and information security is a data issue. Yeah, there's access, there's network infrastructure security, there's cloud security, there's different layers of security that have to be part of a comprehensive, fully responsible model. Whether you're serving that data locally, whether you're providing that data to a constituency, or using that data within the mission. But I think the thread as a security perspective, it kind of comes down to awareness and being of the mindset of being proactive. Ransomware attacks, all the ones you see, whether it's a hospital, a bank, a government agency, we tend to hear about it on the reactive side. Well, it happened and they had to do this, and this particular event was the cause. Where if we're of the proactive mindset and we're anticipating, we're already taking the necessary steps, like making sure our data is protected appropriately, some of the things we've been talking about here, making sure that our user access layer, in terms of some of those processes are in place, and that holistically together we're building to a secure enterprise. That the capabilities of the enterprise, a foundation in that enterprise is security, whether it's applications, whether it's tools, whether it's systems, whether it's things like, it depends on the agency, whether it's citizen data. I mean, a lot of the things that we use and leverage need to kind of fall into that same approach. And the other thing, it's interesting, kind of going to the core of the challenges, people, process, and technology together are really, I think, at the center of this. And that's why when we go bowling, they put the bumpers along the bowling because there's people involved, right? And whenever you have people in the loop, there's always that chance that whether it's going to create a new set of issues or it's going to be a challenge to implement, we have to be of the mindset of looking at that landscape of saying, yes, cybersecurity effectively in a federal agency is a people, process, and technology issue. Every one of those have requirements that we have to be able to address, and that we have to have a continuous loop of continuous innovation and development from a security perspective. So security isn't a secondary or an afterthought.
That's a great way to put that. Jennifer, do you have anything to add? You looked like you were definitely agreeing with David. So
I agree with everything they both shared. The only additions that I would say, because they shared some very helpful information, would go back to the data management and the protection of the data. What we've seen across federal agencies in my capacity, given that I do provide audit services across the government, is that many agencies don't know what they have. And you can't adequately protect what it is you have if you're not aware of the different levels of data, the different sensitivities of that data, who owns the data, whether the data is on-prem, cloud, or in a backup alternate site storage facility of some sort, and what are the security parameters around each of those different areas. They could be similar, they could be different, but you have to have adequate controls in place at every step of the way, whether the data is at rest or the data is in transit. And that is also a part of the education around that. Those that often manage data for our enterprises are often moving through multiple roles and responsibilities for our various organizations. So when you're talking about challenges, resources, personnel can often impact what it is we're doing. Oftentimes we talked about the ransomware, and we highlighted MoveIt, and that was a great summary of what MoveIt in 0 day looks like. But most of those individuals that were moving to help us to navigate through the complexities of our different systems to figure out what could have potentially been compromised and how a bad actor could have maliciously started to laterally move through our environments. Many of those individuals have other roles and responsibilities, whether they're serving system development, network administrative, whether they are actual forensic analysts, but they're serving in different capacities. And sometimes when you're doing so many different things, you could just miss things. It's not on purpose, but many of us in this atmosphere are moving into so many different phases of one day that alert fatigue could happen and you would have missed something.
that's a great point, recruiting, because there are so many, I almost said empty, but so many unfilled like cyber roles in general, but certainly in the government. So yeah, that's an excellent point about recruiting and staff shortages and such. You can only do so much. And I mean, you're human. Everybody you're only can do so much. I wondered, Timothy, if you could just sort of talk about, like, if you had to advise an agency, what steps would you take to get them into a zero trust framework? Like, an agency needs to start out, but they have absolutely no clue what they're doing. So
Okay.
I'm sure no
All right,
federal
nothing.
agency, government agency is like that. But what would you tell them?
Well, I think there has to be, so there's some terminology within the government that they like to use. This is something that kind of came out of 9/11, the 9/11 attacks, of left of boom and right of boom terminology, meaning that boom is an event that you need to, that is bad, right? So in this case, it would be a ransomware attack. You have the left of boom activities that are, we need to do everything we can to prevent that from happening. And then the right of boom being, it happens, now what do? We need, processes in place to mitigate that. And definitely left of boom is priority, right? We want to minimize the risk to the organization by implementing systems like that. And of course, I'll say the easy, and I'm going to do air quotes around easy, right? Is stuff like putting physical restrictions in place and stuff like that. Like, oh, I'm going to secure the network, I'm going to secure the applications. It's easy because it's leveraging the right tools. The harder part, honestly, is changing behavior of the users. And in IT, historically, the mentality has always been, we want to put as minimal changes to user behavior as possible, because it is a very difficult thing to do, and it's very difficult for them to be consistent at it, right? And I think if you are starting out that journey to zero trust, that is number one where you have to start, because most ransomware attacks are not 0-day attacks. They are, somebody in the organization was compromised, most likely without them even knowing it, right? And you have to train users. We talked about just a cybersecurity month and everybody having to do their training. I can't tell you how many companies I talk to where you talk to the users and they're like, yeah, I just click, 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 I'm done my training, right? No, you have to take that seriously, because you don't want to be the person that is taken advantage of, or the person that holds the door open for that person behind them, and they don't have to swipe in or stuff like that. That behavior has to be changed, and you have to start there. I've been in the industry long enough that I remember the days where like everybody in IT was an admin on their primary domain account, and God forbid one of them.
Yeah, that's bad.
Yeah, nowadays that's but there are still organizations that do things like that, right? And all of that needs to be changed for anything else to be successful, right? You have to start there. Once you get that behavior changed, kind of in a parallel effort, you should be hardening your systems. Stuff like STIG hardening or intrusion detection and prevention systems should be being implemented, right? And that goes doubly for cloud-based architecture, right? Because cloud is more publicly facing. It is not in a data center somewhere. There is the potential for, the risk there is higher because it is a public, infrastructure. So that you have to have very, very tight controls over all of that, right? And of course, as I mentioned, all the stuff that's right of boom, that mitigation workflow, and I always kind of go back to the days of disaster recovery, when everybody was like, hey, okay, our disaster recovery plan is we're going to get everybody on the phone and we're going to walk through how we restore this. It's like, I'm sorry, if there's a disaster, I'm off with my family worrying about what's going on there. I am not on an IT phone call trying to get this system up and running, right? People have their own priorities, right? And the same mentality has to be taken. You can't just rely on everybody to be available in these instances. You have to have automated systems. And we talked about, AI being something that is very difficult to kind of get your arms around. But I think AI is really going to help in these instances where they can be more dynamic about recovering from this, from these events. because they are trained, and they're not just trained on what is happening in your organization or your agency. They're trained on what is happening in the industry, and therefore can be much more responsive than any user who, to Jennifer's point, is wearing 5 hats is going to be. Right. This is something that is very specialized. And that's honestly where I see things going. In times, you're going to see more of that machine learning, more of that AI being built into these processes to help not only protect, but also to recover from these events in a much more timely and much more secure manner.
Right. David, I wondered, do you have, excuse me, any examples of agencies that they're doing a good job as far as zero trust? Can be anonymous, doesn't have to be, but is there anything that that you're aware of, or just generally that you want to speak to of an agency?
Yeah, so yeah, and really to the points that are being made here, I've seen it kind of comes down to culture. If you're kind of following the challenge, then you're kind of building to the challenge, hoping nothing happens. I've seen recently, and over the last couple of years, some federal agencies be more proactive and actually developing a model where security, because it is foundational, they're implementing systems and tools that actually are at this intersection of cybersecurity and AI and leveraging machine learning. Because one of the good things, the really helpful things of how machine learning can play a role here is it can detect patterns. It can detect patterns of all types and sizes, whether it's over the last second, over the last year, over the last 5 years, 10 years, and be able to leverage that and bring that together into a level of probability that helps calculate something like risk. So if I've seen agencies, several agencies, deploy this notion of centralized risk management. So at this point, they're effectively managing their enterprise from a risk control and risk management perspective. If one system becomes compromised, then in that model, the proactive probability is kind of already understood because the pattern's been there, or it's been seen over the last period of time. So I think, I really, to sum this up, we're at a very interesting time right now in industry and in innovation and technology where these things are possible. And I think it's an opportunity for agencies to continue to leverage this innovation and really leverage that intersection of cybersecurity and AI and machine learning through these tools. So that way, like I said, you're achieving your risk management objectives. You're more holistically providing a more enterprise approach at data protection and data management. And if something does happen, then your mitigation plan also is included. And that means recovering data. One of the biggest fears that I hear when I go out and talk to federal agency leaders is bare metal recovery. So my entire infrastructure is completely compromised and locked up under a ransomware attack. Now what? So that's when it gets real. That business continuity, or that continuous operations aspect of how to effectively restore in a disaster scenario like that. You have to plan. You have to play like you have to practice like you play. So like going back to my initial comments, it's a culture that you have to ingrain into the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Like so many things, it's a culture. If you don't, if the workforce doesn't embrace it, it's not necessarily going to happen.
Yeah.
So Jennifer, just imagine you can see into the future. So obviously one of the first things you care about is zero trust, right? So where do you see zero trust cyber security being in the next year or so?
So it's going to be around for the long haul. What's going to be very important, summarizing a lot of what all of us have shared today, is as we move through implementing steps towards the maturity model that has been defined by DHS and CISA, we're going to gradually think we've accomplished some goals, which they're going to be great and we need to accomplish, but it'll be a continual progress to really focus on strengthening your environment. Once you accomplish a goal, your time period starts over for adding additional security protections for that environment. So our organizations are really going to have to become a lot more flexible, and because we are allowing people to access our data and then use devices where they are allowed. Some are agency specific, some are bring your own devices. And with the traditional security approaches that we've talked to and through today, they're just not going to work. So with ZTA, implementing a variety of ways an organization can modernize our systems, yes, that's where we're going to go. There's not a one size fits all for any of our agencies because our missions are very different. Our business is different, but we can align those modernized system strategies to the ZTA strategies as we move forward to accomplishing some more of those goals and objectives, to meeting those maturity models, to really helping us to figure out what's going to be most useful for our various organizations.
That's a great point. Now, kind of like the lightning round, because I just looked at the clock and realized we're running out of time. But so, David, what takeaways would you like our audience to know?
And really, it kind of ties right back to Jennifer's last comment. Security protection, data security, data protection, the entire security discussion, information security. It should be taken into the same discussion as modernization. So as we're looking to modernize applications, modernize infrastructure, modernize and increase capabilities, to include security in that modernization discussion. So it'll affect, and it'll set a new requirements for additional funding, because it'll be funding that's driven from security requirements, and it'll have a downstream effect in the rest of the infrastructure, the organization, the things that we're talking about here today. But with modernization, that's a proactive posture. And if agencies can take that proactive posture toward security and not allow it to be an afterthought or a reactive position when something happens, it will allow them to effectively plan for and even have run through scenarios in the agency where they can test these concepts and take that feedback and adjust the concepts and processes to optimize them.
That's great. Timothy, what takeaways would you like attendees to? I'm a writer, right? So that's all. Yeah. That's sorry.
I think both David and Jennifer made great points. This is a process. This is not a project with an end date, right? This is something that, just as you think you have hit your goal, there is a new goal that has been planted 300 yards away from you, right? It's something that you have to continually evolve, because the threat landscape is continually evolving. And I think in order to be really successful at this, I know a lot of organizations, particularly when it comes to government, are very shy when it comes around new technology. Everything has to be vetted out, and for good reason, but these threats are new, and I think new technology is going to be the only way to combat some of them. So I definitely think that process has to accelerate within government agencies of, we need to test this stuff out. We need to make sure that we are secure, and we need to do everything we possibly can. And don't be afraid of machine learning. Don't be afraid of AI, because yes, as much of a threat as it is also a big boon to have in your back pocket for when these things do come on your doorstep, and they will come. So
depending on what news article you see, it's either going to save the world or it's going to destroy it. So
yeah, absolutely.
Jennifer, I'll give you the last word. What takeaways would you like people to go?
I like both of their takeaways. So as we're thinking about how we're going to move towards really implementing ZTA across our organizations and having mature models of what it will look like, so that we can increase and enhance the visibility and automated responses to allow the cyber defenders for our various organizations to really keep up with the pace of the evolving cyber threats. What's going to be really important for us to really consider is how we begin to incorporate zero trust architectural strategic planning efforts at every incremental step of the process of how we provide oversight to our security programs. With providing a roadmap to your strategic plan and looking at your different incremental phases, you can start to reduce some of the risk that could be presented by all of the elements that we discussed today.
That's a great point, making sure that it's there at every stage of the game. I want to thank the three of you so much for being with us today. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I'm so glad that you were here. For everybody in the audience, I just want to give you a quick reminder that we have those great resources on the console for you to download. So make sure you do that before you sign off. And like I said before, check your inbox, because tomorrow we're going to send you a link to the on-demand version. So I just want to, on behalf of GovLoop and Amazon Web Services and Veritas, I really hope you enjoyed this session. I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, and I hope you have a really wonderful rest of your day. Thanks so much, everybody.